Welcome to this special New Books seminar for the year. This is a seminar series that is run by the Department of Media, Communications, Creative Arts, Languages and Literature at Macquarie University. They're usually held online, but today we are hosting this event as a face-to-face opportunity to kick off the start of the semester. The panel, however, is being recorded. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which Macquarie University stands, the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since time immemorial. And we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So we're here today to reflect on the editing and the creation of this book, the 5th edition of the Media and Communications in Australia. I'm delighted to be joined by the co-editor of this book, distinguished Professor Sue Turnbull.
Senior. I haven't got there yet.
Senior Professor Sue Turnbull from the University of Wollongong, who brought me in as co-editor. We have Dr Rowan Tulloch from Macquarie University, who contributed the new, or co-authored, quite substantially new chapter on gaming. And we have Emeritus Professor David Rowe.
Old. Yeah.
We've got more than one emeritus here, and I don't think of you as old. I also think of you as distinguished. So David Rowe from Western Sydney University, who has contributed a hot topic on sports and the media. And last but not least, beaming in is Professor Peter Greste, Professor of Media in the department, who's a first-time MACA contributor. So we've sort of got a bit of a mix on this panel. I think Rowan and Peter were first-time contributors. And he's also author of a hot topic, which was on, remind us, Peter? Media and national security.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So I'd like to start by throwing to Sue to tell us a little bit about the evolution of the earlier editions of this book. We know even that there is some ambiguity around the numbering of these books, these editions, and your role sort of your experience co-editing the last book, the last edition.
Okay, well, on my way in here, free books, guess what I found on the shelf? Media and Communications Australia 2002. Notionally the first, but there were 2 books edited by Graham Turner and Stuart Cunningham before that, just called The Media in Australia. And the first one of those came out in 1993, which was the year I submitted my PhD in media and education. And for me, that 1993 date is auspicious for all sorts of reasons, because I think Graham and Stuart were incredibly strategic, and they are anyway, but they kind of at that moment realised that something was happening around media and communications, and there was a groundswell happening, and it was also the year that we started a media and communications degree at La Trobe University, where I was then. So media and comms was starting to happen, and Graham and Stuart were kind of laying the groundwork for what the field might look like. And it was a really interesting shift, because having come from media and education and my PhD, and I'd worked for the British Film Institute in the UK. Prior to that, I'd been a high school teacher for 10 years. And I'd worked with David Buckingham, who some of you might know, a very distinguished British scholar in the field of media and education. And David has written about the fact that media education was seen in prophylactic terms prior to 1993. That was media education was to stop children being affected by, swallowing by, persuaded by, undermined by, corrupted by, you name it, things being done to them by the media. And what the media in Australia and the media and communications in Australia kind of signalled was, this is a field of study, and what you need to do is you need to understand this. Because, of course, the deep irony was that we had all these students fronting up to university wanting to do media, wanting to be in the media, wanting to participate in the media in one way or another. So there was a kind of real shift, and I think the media in Australia and the media and comms in Australia and its evolution over those years kind of signals what happened to the field. And there's a fabulous PhD in there for somebody who wants to look at the evolution of those books and the debates that were in them. In 1993, Stuart and Graham, in their introduction, described the times as crazy. 1993. Paid television was coming in. There were various things that worried them. The lack of diversity in media ownership, Murdoch and Packer. Okay? Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The tensions between the global and the local, right? What kind of protections should we have for the Australian industry, and what was the impact of the global market? Issues which you can see are absolutely present today, and which Mark Ryan addresses in the cinema chapter, and who did the television chapter. I'll get it in a second, but the television chapter and the cinema chapter are both completely occupied with those very issues. And then there was also the shock of the new. And I had a lovely moment in my gym the other day where, you know how when you're out in the world, you never tell anybody what you do because it's too hard to explain, you know, and you're in the gym and somebody comes up to you and, what are you doing? I'm, media and communication. Oh, I watched the thing on television last night, said this man, on AI. And you know what? There are people who just talk to their avatars. You know, they're not social, they talk to their avatars. I paused for a moment and I said, well, people have been talking to God for a very long time. And he went, oh, I never thought of that. So it was kind of interesting that the same sort of anxieties arise about new media. Every new media form causes the same sort of anxieties. And if you look at the history of these books and you look at the histories of the issues, you can see the way in which the new media and AI crops up in this new book on quite a number of occasions is the site for a new set of anxieties. What's going to happen around those? Other concerns that are still consistent that they were raised in 1993 was about the role of the state, the role of the media in a democracy, still consistent concerns. And one that I thought was really rather poignant in 1993, and that was wondering what was happening to our shared common culture. And if you think about today and the diversity of media, that notion of shared common culture becomes even more fascinating. And for me, where it crops up is, my husband is absolutely addicted to quiz shows. Mastermind. And if you ever watched Mastermind on SBS at 6 o'clock, the general knowledge section used to be about like Shakespeare, Jane Austen, etc., etc. Nowadays, it's about advertising campaigns, it's about new media, it's completely shifted, and so has the demographic of the audience. So this notion of what a shared common culture might be, as it is exhibited in something like a general knowledge scenario, becomes even more interesting in terms of where the media sits in that, because we're all experiencing the media so very, very differently in so many ways. So I guess my provocation would be at the end of this is, so right now in 2024, what stories do we share in common? And I'm speaking there as a television scholar who's been interested in the history of television and the history of storytelling for some time. So that's from me. So back to you.
Thank you, Sue. That was a wonderful distillation of some of the issues that motivated the creation of what we now refer to as MCCALL back in 1983, and the ways in which the field and the project have developed. My first encounter with MCCALL would have been when I was, well, I should perhaps declare publicly for the first time that I never did one undergraduate degree of media. My own background is in history, but I became familiar with these books in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, when I was working on a history of Australian Consolidated Press and reading increasingly about the Australian media through and subsequent to my doctoral studies. In 2006, I was approached by the then editors Graham Turner and Stuart Cunningham to ask if I'd consider writing the chapter on radio. It seemed like something of a daunting prospect then. I was partway through my first reasonably substantial study of radio broadcasting in Australia. So I was in the early stages of writing a book on the history of commercial radio in Australia. And my instinct, I seem to recall, was to say no, but then the question was, well, who else will do it? And that was the issue that Graham Turner had faced. He and Toby Miller had actually co-authored the chapter on radio, but had been struggling to find a real sort of radio expert. So radio studies in Australia, I think it's fair to say, in the early 2000s was nowhere near as expansive as it is today. So I took that chapter on, wrote it for 2006, the 2006 edition. Of course, I had to cover the evolution of the field. I had to cover public service media, so the ABC, SBS radio, commercial radio, and community media, community radio. As I continued, I did revise that chapter then for subsequent editions and update it slightly. By the time I was brought in as co-editor of this book, I actually wanted to step back. I thought it was time for an actual radio scholar, as opposed to a radio historian, dare I say, to take a fresh look at this subject. So after various discussions with various people, we assigned the task to Mia Lindgren, and she was going to be writing about that and podcasting. What we ended up doing, Mia was said that she was still drawing so much on my work that she would like us to consider co-editing that chapter. So the compromise we came to was that we co-authored a chapter on radio together, completely, almost entirely removed podcasting, and commissioned Mia to write a separate chapter on podcasting in this book. When Sue, I think I'm not sure if Stuart, I think, might have spoken to me loosely about the possibility of coming in as co-editor of this book.
I think 2
or 3 years ago.
I thought I chatted you up, actually.
Yeah, I think there may have been a lunch involved.
There was a lunch.
Yeah.
There's been a few lunches.
Yes, so we sort of did and after editing a companion to the Australian media, I was probably thinking I could never edit another book again. But then I thought, well, that had 297 contributors, so how hard could this be? So I did agree to do it. I think we both agreed that the longer lead time we had, the better, because we were both very committed with other projects. But we also thought, because the last edition had been in 2014, that there needed to be a sort of wholesale, fresh look taken at the field and how we would divide up the field. So, first of all, there was a question about whether we would keep the tripartite structure of the book. And we did ultimately decide to largely keep that. So we have the first section, which is
approaches,
which is on approaches to the field, and we had one. We actually had 2 original contributors, didn't we? So we had John Sinclair, who's contributed to all of the volumes, lined up for what he may think is the last time, on theoretical traditions.
Yes.
And we had Stuart Cunningham, who, of course, had been had co-edited all of the previous editions, agreed to write a chapter on policy, regulation and ownership. And I noticed that one of the issues that he probably dealt with less in this iteration of the chapter is convergence, because he's looking at a rapidly differentiated landscape from when convergence was the kind of hot topic, I think, of the last edition. So we did also decide not to include that as an actual hot topic in this issue. I had been concerned that the radio chapter had too much history. So, by which I mean too much historical content, too much about the history of radio. So for this edition, we decided to come up with a bit of a solution, which was I would write a chapter in the approaches section, which would be a short history of the Australian media. So I'd try to get some of the background about the evolution of industries, institutions, takeovers, acquisitions, under the belt of the reader in a kind of short, fairly, hopefully easy to read, fairly accessible, few thousand words. And I essentially finished that chapter up till in the 1990s. And then Gerard Goggin came in and wrote a chapter. He'd contributed previously chapters on the internet in Australia. Obviously, the key change for this book was the absolute centrality of internet, digital and social media. So the number of chapters on those topics proliferated from Gerard's early chapter on the internet and an early chapter on gaming in Australia. So in a sense, Gerard's chapter was the kind of the bookend to my chapter. So he sketched the landscape from the 1990s through to now, and we used the sort of emergence of the digital as the kind of divide there. Sue, is there anything else you want to say at this point about the editing this issue or anything, or shall we move on to the contributors?
No, I'd sort of like to claim. I can't remember which, it would be for the 2014 issue where I actually said to Stuart, what we need are more shorter chapters. And what I asked for was, could we have something that we call hot topics or something, that are 2,000-word essays, because what we actually need is something that models what students might write. You know, something shorter that is more informational. Can we demonstrate how you might write a shorter essay on a specific topic? So that was my contribution to the first volume that I came in on as co-editor, was from the teaching perspective, having used the book in the classroom, wanting something that we could use to say, this is how you write an essay. So, and we kept that in this edition, and I'm very glad that we did. Because I think the really interesting thing is, how is it being used? Is it being used? In many ways, I think it's actually a resource for lecturers, because, you know, you can't take a chapter and teach it. You have to find ways to do it. So I actually think it's a resource for lecturers, and now a kind of multiple history of the media resource in Australia in terms of how we've thought about it.
And I will note, looking at Murray Goot, that the first edition was dedicated to Henry Mayer.
It was.
And,
yes.
Yes. But so, look, I think I'll hand over now. I'd like to hear from you, Rowan. So how you approached revising the gaming industry. So, and we did have various discussions about what we should actually call this chapter.
Yes, we did.
And we did, and we needed to make sure it was consistent in all our versions, and,
Yep.
and it is. We did end up calling it the video game industry, and you did bring in, you proposed early on that you would like to co-edit this with Brendan Keogh.
Yep.
And also I'd be interested to hear if you had used earlier iterations of that chapter previously, and if you'd used the book in your own teaching.
Yeah, so to answer the last question first, I had used the previous chapter. I think it was probably, must have been the 2014 version, the Larissa Hiroth chapter, and I found it really interesting revising the chapter because there was such a strong focus in the 2014 version on mobile gaming, and it was interesting to see how patterns of gaming in Australia had shifted in that time. So there's certain regions of the world where mobile gaming is de facto gaming. You know, Southeast Asian market, it's very much the way that the most video game happens, but that hasn't taken off in Australia in the same way it had these other areas. So when Brendan and I were updating this, we were thinking about, well, how do we theorise the shifts, the epochs, and for us, we kind of decided that the best way to talk about gaming was a history of three eras of gaming, and Brendan very early suggested we focus it around this idea of from bedrooms to studios and back again. So this shift within gaming development from being this hobbyist kind of practice in the 1980s, early 1990s, to then a kind of influx of global capital where Australia became a work for hire kind of centre of gaming, where you'd have highly skilled English-speaking programmers, but you would outsource all the work you didn't want to do to them. So I certainly know people whose early jobs they always called themselves like the shoemaker's elves, if everyone remembers that story of during the night they would go and fix things that were broken, and the teams over in the US who had creative lead would come back, everything would be magically working, and they were very, very happy about it. So Australia had this position where it was doing a lot of this kind of labour, a lot of this grunt work, but there's not much autonomy, there wasn't much creativity, but it was steady work, and there's a lot of kind of the low-end, low prestige games coming out of Australia. So you had a lot of the film tie-in games, or kind of if someone had released a game on PlayStation, then Australians would be hired to make the Xbox version or something like that. But it was steady amounts of money. There was a few companies that kind of had some success in that period. But yes, it was very much tied to the international market. Then you had the GFC, and all that money just vanished from Australia. And Australia, I think, Brendan would have the stats, but I think it went from a relatively small industry, sort of 1,500 people, down to about 300 or 400 people in the space of a handful of months. And so a number of people shifted overseas to get jobs where they could, but obviously not everyone was in a position where they could do that. So a lot of people left the industry, but those who were left were kind of left scrabbling a bit to work out what can they do. And what was interesting was this was at the time of the rise of mobile gaming, but also the rise of indie gaming generally, and a legitimacy and a kind of distribution platform. And in terms of distribution platforms, the rise of digital distribution platforms, so you didn't need to rely on these big publishers. So slowly over time, Australian developers kind of cohered together into little kind of de facto groups. You know, most companies weren't necessarily registered as companies. They were just people working together on an idea here or there. Most of them were, done from bedrooms, done from co-working spaces. And it was interesting in some ways in the way it shared a lot in common with the sort of 1980s scene, but obviously a very different kind of environment. So what was really interesting, to go back to the original question, when reading that 2014 version was the focus on mobile gaming, because that was the first kind of avenue that Australian developers had success. You had your games like Fruit Ninja, which, sold 1 billion copies, or so, at least was downloaded 1 billion times, or ridiculous kind of numbers like that. And Crossy wrote another various other successes. What we've seen since 2014 is that it hasn't just been in the mobile gaming space, but the indie gaming space generally, that the Australian developers have really started to succeed. And games like Untitled Goose Game, Cult of the Lamb, various other ones have been, BAFTA award winning, selling huge amounts. And so it was interesting to kind of track that. And Brendan brought a lot of kind of hands-on knowledge or knowledge. He had interviewed people in every gaming studio in Australia, or at least any gaming studio could find, because obviously it's slightly tricky to identify exactly what is a gaming studio. And he'd found, most gaming studios are 4 people or under. A lot of them are, childhood or school friends or uni friends. There's all these kind of informal networks that form there. So Brendan had a lot of that knowledge. A lot of my work tends to focus on kind of the power dynamics of these situations. And one thing I was really interested in is as we get this shift towards this much more ad hoc version of game development, what happens? What happens to the people who can make games? What happens to the kind of stories that can be told, the experiences that can be presented? And I think it was really fascinating to dive deeply with Brendan into this, because what we see is how complex it is. So on one hand, you have the real negative of, because it's so precarious, you get the same old demographic succeeding in the space. The young, white, able-bodied man is the person who has the resources, has the cultural capital, has the friendship networks, etc., to form these studios. And so obviously there's a massive decrease in the diversity of the workforce. That said, on the flip side, because development isn't controlled by overseas entities, much more kind of Australian ideas, Australian content, Australian sense of humour comes into these games, and you have a very, very different you start to have a semblance of national identity that creeps in, which was something Australia has never managed to get within gaming. And so you have this kind of precarious autonomy within the space, which is still where we are now. When we finished writing the chapter, it looked like things were really going back. A few studios were really developing, and then in the last month, there's been an absolute crunch again in the gaming industry globally, and again, Australia is one of the first to kind of feel the brunt of that. But yeah, so it's this really interesting kind of updating. It was this really interesting kind of view into how things have changed.
Thanks very much, Rowan. And I should note that the tripartite structure of the book consists of approaches, then the meatiest section is industries, and then there's the hot topic section, and you absolutely do win the prize for that, calling the section that. You said to me that, you'd been considering calling the issue section that last time, and I said, let's call it that this time. So thank you very much, Sue. So look, we have 2 authors of 2 hot topics here. Rather than leaving Peter to the end, could we maybe bring him in now? So Peter, I'd be interested in hearing, and please be brutally honest about, when did you first encounter this book? Was it through us? Were you already aware of it? When you looked at the last edition, so by which I mean the 2014 edition, what did you think of it from the perspective, not just as obviously you're a more recent, you're something of a latecomer to academe. How did you always say that to me. How as a media practitioner did you find this book? And then tell us about the experience of actually writing for it.
Look, I feel like a complete novice up against some of the, I was going to say the old fossils, but that's probably going to get me into a whole lot of trouble. But the veterans amongst you. As you said, I'm much more of a journalist than an academic. I had 30 years as a practicing journalist, and so I've really only been in academia relatively recently. I came to early edition through Graham Turner, who I came to know very well at the University of Queensland. And I have incredible respect for Graham and the work the early work that he did, and so you mentioned some of that. And so, I was aware of the book and really loved the way that it sets out, it kind of takes a really broad perspective of the media, but in a way that really draws you into some fascinating depth into each of these topics. And that was the thing that I loved about this one. I've got to confess, I really enjoy dipping into it. It's kind of like a lucky dip, opening up the book wherever the page may fall and diving into the chapter, because there's so much in here that I really enjoy mining. And in some respects, I think I felt a little bit intimidated to be in the book. Bridget, you described the hot topics as kind of normal essays for students, and when you mentioned that approach, I thought, God, I hope that it would be a great honour if students see it this way. And I'm also really gratified that you thought to take the work that I've been doing around media freedom and national security and placing it in there as a hot topic. It's not generally seen as a media topic in a lot of respects. It's the kind of thing that is dealt with more by legal scholars, by national security scholars. But I think it is something that increasingly we need to pay attention to, the relationship between the media, between journalism in particular, and governments, and the security establishment, the role that the media plays in mediating, in holding the truth to power, holding the powerful to account, and that sort of balance which always leans in favour of government. How we need to pull back and reclaim some of that power, some of that authority in the name of the audiences that we serve. I think that's a really important part of the narrative that is often lost by media scholars. So I was really delighted to be a part of the book, very flattered to be sitting there alongside such eminent scholars. So thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of it.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, we were delighted to have you as join the Macca family, as it were. Look, okay, I'll leave the follow-up question for you, and I'll go to David, and then we can talk a little bit more before we open up the floor for any questions or comments. So, David, over to you, who was roped in 45 minutes ago.
Yes. I was hoping to be sitting over there, but it's rather nice to be
back in the limelight.
It's relevance deprivation syndrome. It can be painful. I am one of the people who's written for the book, been in the book before. I remember Bridget contacted me, and I almost begged not to be in at this time. I said, "Don't you want somebody younger? Don't you, this kind of thing, someone different, not me again?" But she insisted on me again, which was very flattering and good. I myself had used, my teaching career. The book, the various versions of the book, and it just hearing Sue and others talking about the early days of teaching media. I was like Graham Turner, Stuart Cunningham, and others. I came out of the old CAE Institutes of Higher Education, applied or vocational area rather than the university. It's where I could get a job, and of course that was where media studies and cultural studies in particular took off before the merging of universities and colleges and institutes of education. And I recall, I hadn't thought about it for a while, but I once used Keith Windschuttle's The Media.
Yep.
People remember
yep.
The Media?
Yep.
And this was at a time when Keith Windschutle was a rather different public figure and an academic, and he wrote a rather ill-disciplined book, but it was solid and a useful resource. And along with, of course, this one and some others, Bonnie and Wilson.
Bonnie and Wilson, Australia's commercial media.
Yes.
Yes.
And all that. So I went back. So I mean, I have had like a dependence on these texts as very, very good resources, especially as any teacher, university teacher would know, being a few pages ahead of the students is always handy, and so you could dive into one of these and get wisdom quickly. So there's that, I suppose, that side of thing, and I suppose my particular hot topic is media, media and sport, sport and media. And that's an area that I've sort of became known for, but I didn't start out working on sport and media. My PhD is on popular music, and I did a lot of other work around tabloid journalism and that kind of thing. But sport, is a consistent hot topic in the media, and I kind of pretentiously developed a concept, the media sports cultural complex, which I retail, of course, in my chapter, which is, I guess, the idea of the interpenetration of media and sport, or, as I say in the chapter, codependency. And I remember having a bit of a chat with Bridget about what codependency is, and I said it's not just some one industry depending on the other, but also the kind of the clinical definition of codependency is wanting the other person to want what you have to offer. So, and it's obviously a complex relationship between sport and media. I guess I would just like finish off this brief discussion from me is that what was the last year? What was the biggest television event for 2 decades?
The Women's World Cup.
Yes, 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup.
Yeah.
Which eclipsed what was the previous one 20 years earlier?
The Olympics.
The Sydney 2000 Olympics. So I don't think you kind of need to sell sport, the importance of sport to the Australian media. I would argue it's one of the factors that's keeping free-to-air television alive, and I've just contributed to the anti-siphoning review that's currently before the Senate, with that idea of that sport is mandated to be shown on certain sport events mandated to be shown on free-to-air television as events of national importance and cultural significance, all of which are sporting events. There's nothing else that I'm aware of that has been listed in quite the same way, protected in quite the same way. And I'd also would suggest that the sportification of media has been important. The other area keeping, say, free-to-air broadcasting alive, TV broadcasting alive, is competitive reality television shows, and they are sport-like. We've kind of learned off each other.
Yeah.
So, characters, and all that. So there's I think that whoever handles the sport and media portfolio in the 6th edition, I was shocked to see that it was 10 years almost since the previous one. Whoa, was it really?
I know.
I'm pretty sure it will be there still as a hot topic, and it could be by then we'll have yet another most important television event, and I'm pretty sure that will be related to sport.
Thanks very much, David. So we've heard from someone who revised a chapter written by someone else, or we'll basically start it again in Rowan, We've heard from David, who revised and updated his own chapter, and we've heard from Peter as a first-time contributor on a new topic. I should just note that we tried in mapping MCCALL to come up. Obviously, we had to substantially think about the contents of the book, but we were also trying to think about the balance of contributors. So we wanted a mixture of some previous contributors and some new contributors. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, you spoke, Sue, about finishing your PhD in '93 when the first edition came out. That one of the things that MCCALL does, I think, is provide or show the sort of generations of media and communication scholarship in Australia.
I think we need to say that maybe we should be a little bit embarrassed about this because it wasn't in 2014, but this is the first time we've had a chapter on Indigenous media and communication.
Yeah.
And I think that marks a significant shift.
Yes.
And it is also a reflection on the past, that we haven't had that. So I'm sorry Bronwyn couldn't be here because she's actually written a beautiful kind of historical chapter coming into the present. And I think that is so important that we've got that there.
Yes.
And we've also got a chapter on diversity.
Yes.
There is a way in which I would argue that the culture has shifted quite significantly from 1993 media in Australia to now. There are significant shifts, even if the concerns are somewhat similar.
Yes, that's right. So it is a shame that we don't have distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson with us. We were keen to involve her in the book. We did have quite a debate. We had a planning day with contributors, which we did online during COVID.
Yeah, we did.
And Bronwyn Carlson was part of that, and at that stage she was going to be contributing a hot topic on indigeneity, but as the day went on, we were discussing more and more about the importance of the issue and the theme, but also the evolution and the making a claim and showing the evolution of Indigenous media and communications in Australia dating back to the 1830s. So by the end of the day, actually I think Bronwyn wasn't able to be there from memory. So we had to go back to her and say, we're having a debate, would it be better to actually have a standalone chapter on this?
And we want you up front.
And yes, and she did agree to do it. But we also did try to be mindful as editors to be attuned to issues of cultural and gender diversity throughout the whole book. So not just to have it carved off in one chapter or one hot topic, but to have all authors thinking through and reflecting on these issues in their own pieces.
Yep.
Look, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions or comments from the audience, and we do have a roving mic, which David will pass around to whoever first puts their hand up. So I think we have Chris.
Can I just pick up on David remarking about, I used to teach a course called Australian Television way back. And after the Sydney Olympics, remember they issued that, I've got it still in my office, but I'm retiring at the end of this year. There's going to be a garage sale. You need to come to my office. The video, the video cassette of the Olympics is still there. And I used to use that in the Australian television class to talk about the construction of an Australian narrative, because you would remember in the Sydney Olympics, it began with that child and the swimming coach, and then it went into the whole Indigenous area. Then there was a welcome there, and then there were all these different scenarios from Australian kind of life, and it was always a revelation to students that we were taking this seriously, that there was a way in which when you looked at this, you could say, what story are they telling you about Australia? Whose story are they telling? And that this was involved in a sporting event. And it was just always such a great class to do, because the actual video itself was compelling in its own way. And I think MIA, whatever it was at the time, Media Information Australia, did an issue on the Olympics.
Did, yeah.
I think they did.
I was in there.
You were in it? Of course you were. Yeah.
And past editor.
Yeah.
Any questions from anyone?
Joe. Dr. Joe Chipperfield from the Research Office.
That's right, formerly of this parish. I see, as you mentioned, that it's been 10 years since the previous edition, and there have been some pretty seismic changes that I think all of you have touched on in that time. And without wanting to condemn you to a repeat performance too soon, do you think that there would be similar changes over a shorter time that might require another edition, or do you feel that the changes that have occurred in the last 10 years, this edition can still reflect for another maybe 8-9 years?
What do you think, Sue?
I think there should be a new edition every 5 years.
Yeah.
Frankly, but I'm probably not going to be involved in the next one. I'm thinking. So it's a question of whether there'll be continuity, whether you can persuade Bridget to have another go at it in 5 years' time, or whether there'll be new editors. I mean, there was a moment when Stuart and Graham were kind of going, who's going to do it? And I sort of said, well, I'm already thinking about it, and I'm thinking about Bridget. And they went, fine. And there was a shift, blokes to Sheilas, as it were. And yeah. And I think it should go on. I think it's an important volume. But again, of course, you've got what is the future of media and comms as a discipline being taught in universities. And of course, we've now got, is the government going to reverse the additional charges on the stupid increases that they put on those humanities subjects? Because that will kill a discipline if we're not careful.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also a question around the role of the nation state and the field of media and communications, and whether you can justify a book that is just about, a particular national site. So, and, I think the way we dealt with that was we, in a number of places, were looking at international media that have a place in the Australian media landscape, so that aren't just, generated by or created by or produced in Australia. I think 10 years was too long. But at the same time, it made this project quite exciting to do.
Yeah, it actually, the reason why it didn't happen before was the publisher wasn't interested. But they sold the last edition 2 years ago to China. And I think the publisher then went, oh, maybe. We haven't heard anything about it being sold to China yet. But I think the publisher went, there's a market.
Yeah.
So I actually think it's a publishing issue that if there's a market for the book, it will continue. It's not really our decision.
That's right. We'll see how it sells and see what the downloads are like, because in reality, there won't be thousands of copies of printed editions sold. That seems unlikely. Peter, could I ask you, I mean, is this a book that you think that colleagues or former colleagues in the media, so this sounds like a Dorothy Dixer, but that they should be reading it, they should be aware of it? And if so, how do we make them aware of it?
Well, the first bit's easy, and I do think they should be aware of it. I think, because as I said, from my perspective, being able to dive into it and understand other bits of the media, we say me and my colleagues all say we work in the media, but we work in little silos of the media. And having something like this that gives us a much broader perspective of an industry that we are intrinsically a part of, but so rarely get a serious view of, is really important. The question of how we get it in front of them is a much more complicated issue. Let me just, before I answer that, I just want to say I think 5 years is the right time to review it. The 10 years since 10 years, things change so incredibly quickly in this business, and what, as we've seen, the digital digital environment has just turbocharged the rate of change. It's highly likely TikTok is now dominating a lot of social media communication. I suspect in 10 years it'll have long come and gone and will have been replaced by other new forms of communication. And AI is going to change the way that we think about and the way that we all communicate in ways we can't possibly understand. And I suspect even in 5 years' time things will have changed enormously. As for getting in front of our colleagues, I just think that we need to be talking, we need to be pushing it, we need to be dropping it in the lobby of media companies. I do think, as I said, it's a very easy read, and it's a fascinating read because it does give you a chance to bite off really digestible chunks and dive in more deeply if you feel the urge to go into those sectors in a way that I think is eminently readable. So I don't see any reason why my colleagues wouldn't want a copy on their coffee table.
Thanks, Peter. So, and just in terms of the scope of this book, there's 32 chapters
it's
by
the biggest.
36 contributors.
It's
so about
the biggest.
150 or 60,000 words, I think.
Yeah. It's a big book. And the queen of the Excel spreadsheet, the organisation, Bridget was the one who masterminded the incoming and the outgoing. I just kind of sail through, cheerfully, but she was the mastermind.
I'm normally terrible with Excel. Like, I couldn't believe that for the first time in my life, I was advocating that I A, created a spreadsheet and B, tried to sell the benefits of Excel to someone else.
Can I just raise, I think an interesting point was raised really about whether it's possible to write a book of this kind today or in the future, which has "in Australia" in the title, and I would say absolutely yes. I think, I've written more about globalisation and transnationalism than I care to remember, but the concept of the nation, the operational concept of the national, is still incredibly powerful. I see no evidence that it is going to disappear. Now, the Australian Academy of the Humanities this year is returning. Thank you, Graham Turner. In its symposium, will be dealing explicitly with the concept of nation, and it is recurring. So we all use media that crosses national boundaries and so on in a whole series of ways, but the power, the discursive power, the effective power of the idea of nation, the way it's used and abused, the way it's a mode of identity or competing identities for people, etc., and played out in the media, is for me still undiminished.
Here.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point to end on. Peter.
I was just going to say that not only do I completely agree with David that it remains and will remain relevant, but I also think it's really important that we claim a degree of I was going to use the word sovereignty, but that's wrong. That implies a degree of control. But we claim or make sure that we stake out that space, that we identify and recognise and study Australian media and the way in which we as a community talk to ourselves. And yes, it will become increasingly globalised and influenced by international media companies. But it is we are a culture, we're an island state, and I think it's really important that we continue to maintain works like this that focus on our own national media and communication space.
Thanks, Peter. Last question or comment to Dr. Nick Hurd, television scholar.
Yes, just a comment on the whole question of nation and internationalisation. I don't know whether how the book deals with it, but I have been observing the way in which particularly the television production industry and film industry is internationalised. And we talked about 1993. You go back to Reg Grundy, who was the first producer to really, what he called parochial internationalism. But we are witnessing at the moment the fact that Large numbers of television companies are owned by global multinational companies. We are seeing an ever-increasing amount of international production that is creatively not generated in Australia. I think last financial year it was worth $401 million. And, you know, so I think, yes, the nation state will stay, but I think the scholars need to turn attention to...
The cinema chapter and the TV chapter both address these issues, Nick.
Good.
So they take those on absolutely front and centre.
Great.
All right, thank you very much. We normally try to finish these seminars on the dot of 5. We're 1 minute past, so I think that's pretty impressive. So there won't be a late penalty. But I'd, in addition to thanking our erstwhile contributors, Peter, David, Rowan, and of course, my excellent co-editor. It was a pleasure to edit with you. Thank you for honouring me by bringing me into this enterprise, bringing me even closer into this enterprise. I'd like to thank Dr Chris Muller for his efforts helping to organise today, especially when I was trapped in meetings this afternoon, and the MCCALL operations team of Mike Baber, Alex Ryan, David... Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Last but not least, thank you so much for all of the work that you've done to enable this to be recorded for posterity. So this will be part of the MCCALL YouTube channel. Maybe it'll go viral with the media industry when, you know, Peter develops our marketing strategy for us. You're like, you know people, more people than we do.
So it's outdoor marketing.
So thank you all very much for coming, and that's
a wrap.
over and out. Thank you.